You won't believe what happened at this wedding. Everything was going perfectly, beautiful flowers, music, guests waiting for the moment when the boy's father would say the cherished I do. But suddenly everything changed. The boy ran out into the middle of the hall, his face pale with fear, and the words he said made the hearts of everyone present stop. What would you do in your father's place? Write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. It is very important for us to know who you are and where you are with us. Each of your messages helps promote our channel and supports us in creating such incredible stories. You are our inspiration. The father was shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing from his own son, but when the boy revealed the secret of the bride, it became clear this was not just a family drama. The father was forced to act immediately. What happened next? Why did he call 911? We know how much your likes and comments mean to us and how they help us grow. You are an integral part of our history, and without you this channel simply would not exist. We are grateful to each of you for your support, because thanks to you we can continue to create such videos. It all began on a bright sunny day, when hundreds of guests gathered to witness the most beautiful wedding of the year, a wedding that was supposed to be a celebration of love and success for Jeffrey Williams, a black billionaire who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most influential figures in the business world. For Jeffrey, this day meant more than just the union of two hearts. It was a symbol of his triumph over all the odds, over the systems that had spent decades trying to break him. But despite the success that surrounded him, behind the smiles of the guests, the lavish flowers and the tables laden with food, there was something much darker. From the start, Jeffrey sensed an undercurrent of tension, like a constant whisper behind his back. His new high society acquaintances always seemed friendly and respectful on the surface, but when he turned away, their true thoughts would spill out. He was an outsider to them, someone who, despite all his wealth and influence, would never be part of their circle. The bride, Elizabeth, came from one of the most prestigious white families, with roots going back generations of influential politicians and businessmen. Her parents could hardly hide their disapproval. They always avoided looking Jeffrey in the eye. Their conversation was dry, their smiles were forced. He knew the feeling all too well. He had been dealing with it all his life. To them, he was nothing more than their daughter's successful exotic acquisition. Meanwhile, the crowd surrounding the newlyweds was seething with excitement. But when little Trey, Jeffrey's son from his first marriage, began to slowly make his way through the ranks of guests to the altar, there was an anger in his eyes that was impossible not to notice. Everyone knew that the boy had a difficult relationship with Elizabeth. He always kept to himself, refused to call her mom, although she tried with all her might to earn his trust. When Trey, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, walked to the center of the room, everyone fell silent. His small hands trembled, but he did not take his eyes off the bride. It seemed as if the air thickened. 1,000 thoughts were spinning in his head, but he knew one thing: this was the moment of truth. "Daddy, don't do this." The boy's voice sounded unexpectedly loud and piercing, cutting through the tense silence. The guests looked at each other in surprise, and Jeffrey seemed to freeze in place, not understanding what was happening. Elizabeth, standing at the altar, turned pale. She knew the boy hated her, but she hadn't expected such a performance. Trey took a step forward, his gaze becoming even more determined. "You don't know who she really is." His words echoed in the silence like a bolt from the blue. "She hates us. All of us, the black ones. She thinks you're worthless, that your place is to be a servant. You're just a toy to her." The crowd gasped. Some of the guests began to whisper. Some began to whisper louder, discussing what they had heard. Jeffrey felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He had always known that Elizabeth and her family were suspicious of him, but he had never believed that she could be so two-faced. "Enough, Trey," Elizabeth cried out loudly, her voice shaking as did her hands, clutching the bouquet. "You are too young to understand such things. Your words are baseless." But at that moment, Trey pulled a small tape recorder out of his pocket. He pressed the play button, and her voice, full of hatred and contempt, echoed through the room. "He thinks he can buy love and respect, but to me he will always be just a black man. Even if he is a billionaire, I will marry him because I want his power, his money, but in my eyes he is nobody. Do you understand? His money will not make him white." The words, spoken coldly, echoed through the room. Time seemed to stand still. Jeffrey heard a loud hissing in his ears, his world crumbling before his eyes. He had always known that he would never fit in this society, but he had not expected such a betrayal from the woman he was about to call his wife. The guests were silent, shocked by what they had heard. Some quietly left the room. Others could not take their eyes off Jeffrey and Elizabeth. Someone finally spoke, and the words echoed in the heads of the others. "How could she? Jeffrey was silent, but something inside him broke. He slowly took out his phone and dialed 911. Jeffrey's phone shook in his hands as he dialed 911. His entire life, built on patience, perseverance, and the constant struggle with prejudice, was crumbling before him. Among the guests who had been cheering and smiling at him just minutes before, now those smiles had turned into stone masks, hiding uncertainty and fear. No one knew what to say or how to react. How to react when the truth was revealed so unexpectedly and so mercilessly. Trey stood next to his father, his face firm but his eyes full of tears. He knew what he had done was right, but he also knew that he had hurt his father. But the truth could no longer be hidden. Jeffrey had always taught him to be honest and fair, to fight for himself no matter what, and now the boy perhaps understood that better than his father himself. Elizabeth froze. There was despair in her eyes, but no remorse. She knew it was over. Her carefully constructed image had crumbled in a matter of seconds. Her white wedding dress, which had once seemed a symbol of purity, was now saturated with bitterness and hatred. All eyes were on her, as if she were a criminal caught red-handed. Jeffrey finally spoke, his voice quiet but with a deep power no one expected. He didn't scream, didn't show his pain openly, but every word he said hit harder than any blow. I've dedicated my entire life to proving that I'm worth something, that I'm more than the color of my skin, that I can build something that takes me beyond all the stereotypes that have been imposed on me since childhood. I became who I am not because of you, not because of society, but in spite of it all. And you, Elizabeth. His voice wavered, but he continued, you were the person I trusted the most. You were supposed to be the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. He paused, looking around at the crowd of guests who were listening with bated breath to his every word. But here's what I realized. His eyes darkened, and his voice grew firmer. To some people, even with billions to my name, I'll always be just a black guy. To you, I was just another stepping stone you planned to use to climb higher. Your love was a lie. Your respect was a lie. And now you stand here, in front of all these people, and you can't even apologize. Elizabeth seemed to want to say something, but could not find the words. Her face was as white as her dress. Her whole being seemed to shrink under the pressure of a truth she could no longer deny. Meanwhile, the guests, who were part of high society, looked on with ill-concealed relief. They had never seen Jeffrey as an equal. To them, he had always been an outsider, a symbol of an unacceptable intrusion into their closed world. Now their opinions were confirmed. They saw his weakness in this moment of humiliation. Suddenly there was the sound of footsteps. It was the arrival of the police. The officers, excited by the report of some incident, entered the hall and looked at the scene appraisingly. One of them, tall and strong, approached Jeffrey. Mr. Williams, did you call the police? What happened here? All eyes turned back to Jeffrey, but this time not as a victim, but as a man whose willpower now decided the fate of everyone present. Yes, I did. His voice was confident, and he stood tall despite the emotional storm raging inside him. I want you to take her away. He pointed at Elizabeth. For fraud, for conspiracy. She tried to use me for her own purposes, and I intend to prove it. Elizabeth froze when she heard this. Her eyes widened in horror. Until that moment, she had thought that even in the worst case, she would simply leave Jeffrey's life with his money. But now she was threatened with something much worse. She took a step back, but the police immediately surrounded her. Wait, this is all a misunderstanding, she screamed. These are just the words of a child. You can't arrest me for this. The officers exchanged glances, not quite understanding what was going on, but one of them replied, Miss, if you have any evidence, you will have to present it in court. But for now, we must follow protocol. Elizabeth, completely broken, tried to break free, but was immediately grabbed by the wrists. The guests looked on in confusion. Some were whispering, some were recording what was happening on their phones, and some simply could not believe that an ordinary wedding could turn into such a nightmare. But for Jeffrey, this wasn't just a moment of revenge or triumph over those who had tried to humiliate him. It was the moment he finally realized that even all his billions, all his influence, couldn't change one thing: the deep-seated racism that permeated everything from his business to his personal life. What he had always felt was now exposed. They would never let him forget who he really was in their eyes. As the police escorted Elizabeth out, Jeffrey glanced back at Trey. The boy stood with his head down, feeling guilty for ruining his father's day, but Jeffrey walked up to him and put his hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing, son, he said quietly, but his words carried louder than all the noise in the room. I'm proud of you. The guests, who had just been ready to applaud Jeffrey in his new life, now stood there in confusion. Their hypocrisy had been exposed. As soon as the police escorted Elizabeth out of the hall, everything around became even more tense. An oppressive silence hung in the air, pierced by anxious whispers from the guests. Everything they had just seen and heard turned the solemn wedding into a gloomy spectacle. The glittering candelabra, luxurious flowers and expensive jewelry seemed to have become part of the scenery for a tragedy in which the main character was taken apart in front of everyone. Jeffrey stood at the altar, knowing that his life would never be the same again. The guests who had come to celebrate now stood like shadows. Some hurried to leave the room, unwilling to witness this disgrace, so that they could distance themselves from it later. Others, on the contrary, remained, transfixed by a tragedy that they could not have foreseen. Jeffrey's face expressed a mixture of suppressed anger and deep sadness. Only a few minutes ago he stood at the pinnacle of his success, surrounded by all the signs of wealth and power, but now it all seemed meaningless. Deep down, he had always known that racism would never completely disappear, despite his billions, despite his status and power, but he had believed that in Elizabeth. He had found someone who was above it all, someone who could share not only his wealth but his life. And now, standing in the ruins of his dream, he realized the depth of the betrayal. Every word she had said on the recording echoed in his soul. His gaze fell on the remaining guests. Some tried to appear sympathetic, but their eyes gave them away. These were the same people who had discussed behind his back how a black man could not be worthy of their circle, even if he had made a fortune. To them, he was an outsider, a symbol of an alien intrusion into their privileged world. One of the guests, an elderly man with whom Jeffrey had recently signed a multi-million-dollar agreement, stepped forward, but his face expressed not only concern but also hidden mockery. "Jeffrey," he said slowly, as if choosing each word, "I'm so sorry it happened at your wedding. No one could have foreseen that Elizabeth would be so, well, you know, but perhaps you should have been more careful with your choice of company." These words, spoken casually, struck Jeffrey in the heart. This man who had recently flattered him, seeking to conclude a favorable agreement, now spoke to him as if he were to blame for his own humiliation, as if Jeffrey's billions were just a temporary accident, and his true nature was still the same as before: black, unworthy, alien. "Careful with your company?" Jeffrey whispered, his voice quiet but full of pain. "Are you saying it's my fault that the woman I love turned out to be a hypocrite?" The man, feeling that he had gone too far, quickly retreated, but it was too late. Jeffrey could no longer contain the pain that had built up inside him. "Let's be honest," Jeffrey continued, louder now, his voice ringing out across the room, making every guest pause. "All of you, every single one of you, are only standing here because I've made more money than you could ever imagine, but that hasn't changed anything. I'm still a stranger to you. You smile to my face, but laugh behind my back. You admire my success, but you'll never truly accept me." He took a step forward, and his figure looked impressive and proud against the backdrop of the festive hall. "You think your society is unattainable, that money can allow me to enter your world but not become part of it. You hope that my marriage to Elizabeth would prove you right, that even the most successful black men cannot escape your judgment." Jeffrey's words echoed around the room. There was still too much wealth around him, too much outward luxury, but now it seemed empty and meaningless to him. None of these people understood him. They saw him only as a status, not as a person. One of the younger guests, who had been standing by the wall all this time and silently watching what was happening, suddenly broke the silence. "Are you serious, Jeffrey? You're a billionaire. You have everything you could ever want. How can you talk about unfairness when you have more money than all of us here combined?" Jeffrey turned to him, his gaze cold but full of strength. "Money can't buy respect. It can't buy love. You saw what happened today. Elizabeth never loved me. She only loved what I could give her. And, frankly, many of you here do the same. You only respect my wealth, but inside, you see me as the same person you saw in my younger years. Nobody." The young man fell silent, realizing that he had crossed the line and realizing the truth that he himself had tried to ignore. Trey, who had been standing next to his father the entire time, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He raised his head, and his voice sounded unexpectedly clear. "Dad, they just don't understand. You always taught me that it doesn't matter what others think, it's our actions that matter. You proved that you can achieve anything you want, not for them, but for yourself. Jeffrey looked at his son and squeezed his hand. Those words awakened something new in him. He realized that despite all the unfairness of the world, he still had what was important: his family, his son, who saw him as a hero and not a victim. "You're right, son," he answered quietly. "You and I can do anything. We've been through a lot already, and this is just another test." The guests gradually began to leave the room, but their eyes remained fixed on Jeffrey for a long time. He remained standing at the altar, surrounded by the remains of his shattered dream, but with a deep-rooted sense of inner strength. The wedding that was supposed to be the culmination of his success turned into a symbol of struggle, not only with personal pain, but also with those invisible barriers that continued to haunt him throughout his life. As the guests began to leave, every step echoed in the emptiness that filled the opulent wedding hall. Jeffrey felt a cold wind of mistrust and betrayal creeping through his skin. He stood at the altar, surrounded by wealth created over years of hard work, but now it seemed like an empty symbol, devoid of true value. There were still glasses of champagne on the tables, perfectly decorated dishes remained untouched, and the custom-made white roses smelled of a tenderness that had disappeared in a whirlwind of lies and hatred. But now Jeffrey couldn't turn away from reality. Trey stood next to him, silently looking out at the empty room that had once been filled with joy. For the boy, this day was more than just a broken wedding. It was his first real lesson in how the world really looked at people like them. The remaining guests, the city's most influential businessmen, politicians and elite, watched the proceedings in silence, as if they were in a theater where a tragedy was unfolding. Their faces were stony, as if they were trying to hide their true feelings, but behind that mask lurked the same old racism that, as it turns out, persists even in a world of billions. One of Elizabeth's friends, Julia, a fair-haired woman with a cold gaze who always demonstrated her noble origin and status, approached Jeffrey. "Jeffrey," she began, her tone soft but disdainful, "we all know that what happened today was a misunderstanding." Trey was obviously emotional. It was just a burst of childish jealousy. "But honestly, you know you shouldn't have trusted someone like Elizabeth. She didn't come from the same background. Maybe you should have looked for someone closer to your roots." Her words, veiled as concern, were laced with toxic contempt. It wasn't the first time Jeffrey had heard such innuendo, but this time they cut deeper. These words weren't just about him and Elizabeth. They were about everything he was trying to build. Julia, like so many others here, hadn't even made a secret of the fact that she saw him as an outsider, despite all his wealth. "Closer to my roots?" Jeffrey repeated, his voice bitter and harsh. "You think there's a right place in this world for people like me? That even if I became the richest man on the planet, I would still be wrong to you?" Julia smiled weakly, but it was clear in her eyes that she thought she was right. "Jeffrey, we don't make the rules. The world is what it is. Everyone has their place." These words, spoken so calmly, as if it were something natural, brought out the anger in Jeffrey that he had barely contained for all these years. For people like her, racism was not something active and overt, but simply part of the world they lived in. They saw no problem in believing that everyone had a role, and that this role did not change even if you were rich and powerful. For them, Jeffrey's success was an aberration, and they were waiting for everything to return to normal. "I thought that money and status would give me access to this world," he continued, louder now, so that everyone else could hear. "I thought I could prove that I was no different from you, but you will never accept me as an equal, because in your eyes I will always stand in the shadow of your privilege, your prejudices." The guests stared at him in silence, some rubbing their hands nervously, others trying to avoid his gaze, but each of them knew that Jeffrey was right. They could admire his success from a distance, but they could never allow him to become part of their world on equal terms. He was an example of how the system they lived in could provide access to money, but not recognition. At that moment, Jeffrey was approached by his close friend and business partner, James, one of the few people he truly trusted. James was a white man who had grown up in the same system, but had always shown respect and understanding towards Jeffrey. "Jeff, let's just get out of here," he suggested quietly, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You've proven your point. There's nothing left to gain here." But Jeffrey shook his head. He couldn't just walk away and leave this room full of hypocrites as it was. He needed them to hear him through. "No, James," he replied, pushing his friend's hand away. I have to finish this. They have to understand. He turned to the guests again, this time no longer hiding his anger. This whole farce is a reflection of your world. You accept me as long as I play by your rules, but as soon as I start playing my game, you immediately remember that I am not one of you. You are ready to applaud me as long as I remain at a distance, but when I come closer, you move away. Jeffrey's words sank into the souls of those who remained. Like shards of ice, they had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as progressive, enlightened, but the truth Jeffrey was telling was impossible to ignore. He was a reminder that the world had not changed as much as they wanted to believe. You call yourselves elite, he continued, clenching his fists, but the real elite are those who can rise above prejudice, who see people for their souls and not their skin color. But here in this room, all I see is fear. Fear that I, a black man, have risen higher than you could ever imagine. You're not afraid of me personally. You're afraid of what I represent. You're afraid that your system could collapse. He took a step forward and his voice became louder. You talk about progress, equality, opportunities for all, but you keep your doors closed to those who don't fit in. You're afraid that the world will change, and that you'll have to share your place in the sun. But know one thing, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. We're not leaving. Trey's eyes, standing next to his father, blazed with pride and understanding. For the first time, he saw what real power was, not the power of money or status, but the power of being right in a world where truth is not always recognized. Jeffrey took a last look at the guests, many of whom were now hiding their gazes. No one wanted to admit the truth he had spoken, but it was inevitable, like a wave that was slowly but surely rolling into their comfortable world. This wedding is just a symbol of what you've never been able to accept, Jeffrey finished, and if all that matters to you is what's on the surface, then I have no business here. With that, he turned to his son and took his hand. Together they walked toward the exit, leaving behind this room full of illusions, lies, and racist stereotypes. But before they left, Jeffrey paused for a moment, looked at Julia, and said, I have found my place, and you will have to search for yours for a long time. As Jeffrey took his son's hand and headed for the exit, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. He could feel the eyes on him, some full of condemnation, others of hidden relief, and some openly expressing schadenfreude. There were always those in the room who had considered his appearance at the highest levels of society a misunderstanding from the very beginning. They tolerated him only because he had become a billionaire, but he had never received real recognition. And now, as his world collapsed before everyone's eyes, they saw it as confirmation of their internal prejudices. Jeffrey felt something rise up inside him, not just anger, but a deep, decades-old bitterness. As a boy, he had known that he would always have to be twice as smart, twice as hardworking, to achieve what white people were born with. He had learned that lesson as a child, in the poor neighborhoods, where every word and every look from white people was laced with distrust and contempt. Those who had once doubted his abilities were now triumphant inside. One of the guests, an elderly man with gray temples and an expensive suit, standing at the edge of the crowd, could not contain himself. Well, Jeffrey, his voice was sarcastic and loud, so that everyone could hear, I guess not all the money in the world can hide the truth. Ha! The voice elicited silent support from several corners of the room. Some of the guests, who had previously been shy about openly expressing their feelings, now nodded quietly in agreement. There was mockery in their looks, hidden under a mask of politeness, and a heightened sense of superiority. They saw in Jeffrey an example of how everything falls into place. The truth? Jeffrey turned sharply on him, his voice firm but defiant. What truth do you mean, Stephen? The truth that despite my success, despite my wealth, despite all my accomplishments, in your eyes I remain just a black boy from the poor neighborhood? Stephen shrugged, keeping a smug expression on his face. He was one of the old guard, the kind who had never faced real competition from the likes of Jeffrey in their lives. It's not the color of your skin, Stephen said with a hint of arrogance. It's just that some people, no matter what their condition, will never fit in with us. His words, laced with latent racism, burned Jeffrey. This was exactly how he had felt throughout his life. Even as his business took off, even as he bought houses and yachts and joined elite clubs, deep down, he knew that for people like Stephen and others like him, his success was an anomaly, an aberration that would sooner or later correct itself. Your circle? Jeffrey smiled bitterly. You mean there are circles that black men are not allowed in? No matter how much money they make, do you think that white skin automatically gives you the right to consider yourself superior to me? Stephen, like many others, tried to remain unperturbed, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. He knew that Jeffrey was right, although he did not want to admit it. After all, his world had always been built on an unwritten rule: white people occupy the most important places, and black people should know their place. Nobody said it outright. One of the women standing nearby intervened. It was Linda, the wife of a major investor. Her voice was soft, but there was a venomous note of patronage in it. But not everything can be measured in money, Jeffrey. You may be a successful businessman, but there are some things that money can't buy. You know what I mean, right? Yes, Linda, Jeffrey said, his voice full of contempt. I understand. You talk about privilege that's passed down. White privilege that makes you right. Right. I earned every cent I have in a world that tried to keep people like me down. But you think I don't belong in your circle because my skin is a different color. His words were like a hammer blow. They shattered the silence that had once again fallen over the room. Now many of those present were no longer hiding their displeasure. This man, who had dared to rise to their level, was now openly accusing them of what they had always tried to hide behind a polite smile and refined manners. This isn't about skin color, Jeffrey, Stephen finally said, clearly annoyed. This is about you trying to destroy an order that's existed for centuries. You want to prove that everyone can be equal, but it's not. Equality doesn't exist. You've proven that yourself. No, Stephen, Jeffrey said, his voice loud and furious now. You're the one who's proven that equality doesn't exist for you. It's always going to matter to you that I'm black. You can't accept the fact that I'm a successful person standing here on your equal footing because it threatens your privilege. He took a step forward, his eyes flashing. This whole world, your world, is built on a lie. You tell yourself that white people are better, more worthy, more successful by default. But the truth is, you're afraid of those who don't fit that stereotype. You're afraid that your control over this world is crumbling. And you know what? It is crumbling. The silence became unbearable. Everyone in the room knew that he had told Jeffrey the truth they had been avoiding for so long. He stood before them as a symbol that the old order was changing, that the world could no longer remain as they knew it. His success was their failure, his presence their defeat. At that moment, another figure approached the altar, an old family friend of Jeffrey's, an elderly black man named Harvey, who had once been his mentor in business. Harvey slowly approached and placed his hand on Jeffrey's shoulder. You're right, Jeffrey, he said quietly but confidently. They'll never accept us, but that doesn't mean we should give up. We belong here because we deserve it. Harvey addressed the guests. You are all here because the world is changing. Whether you admit it or not, the old order is crumbling, and those who are not ready to change with the world will remain in the past. Your views, your sense of superiority, it no longer works. Harvey's words sounded like a prophecy of the future. The world would no longer be the same as Stephen and Linda knew it. Their privileges based on skin color and status were slowly eroding. Jeffrey felt a new strength in himself. Looking at his old friend, he knew there were many battles ahead. But today he had proven the main thing: racism and prejudice could no longer rule his life. And even though his wedding had failed, his fight was just beginning. He squeezed Trey's hand and, with one last glance at the guests, left the room, leaving them immersed in silence and the realization that their world had truly changed. As Jeffrey, his son, and Harvey walked away from the altar, there was a heaviness in the air, as if something huge and invisible was pressing down on everyone present. Some of the guests began to whisper quietly, looking warily at those leaving. Every word Jeffrey said, every accusatory look he gave, continued to hover in the room, causing those who remained to fidget nervously in their seats. Elizabeth, the bride Jeffrey had recently planned to marry, stood motionless in a white dress. Like a statue, her gaze was directed somewhere into the void. Just a few minutes ago, she was on the threshold of the most important thing in her life, a wedding with a billionaire who, despite all the difficulties, achieved success. But now this moment was completely destroyed. Elizabeth felt the heavy gazes of the guests on her, waiting for her to speak, to justify what was happening, to take responsibility for what had just happened. But her heart was in turmoil. She herself had not expected things to turn out this way. It just couldn't end like this, she thought, feeling her knees buckle. How could it have come to this? Deep down, She always knew that her relationship with Jeffrey couldn't be easy. Elizabeth grew up in a wealthy, white family, surrounded by people who instilled in her a sense of superiority from a young age. In her world, success and status were determined not only by how much money you had, but also by your social background. And although she truly loved Jeffrey, somewhere deep down, she always knew that her parents, her friends, and all the elite did not approve of her choice. They always saw something inappropriate in her relationship with Jeffrey. Now that the truth had come out, Elizabeth felt the weight of racial prejudice that she had never faced directly. She felt that her personal feelings, her love for Jeffrey, were now overshadowed by the fact that those around her saw him as only a black man, despite his money and status. Elizabeth, you knew! Her mother's quiet voice came from behind her. Her mother, an elegant middle-aged woman with gray eyes that always reflected severity and implacability, came up to her daughter. I always told you it was a bad idea. This marriage would be a mistake. We can't just ignore reality, no matter how much you want to. You didn't see him for real, and now it's obvious. Elizabeth turned to her mother, her eyes filling with tears. Real? She whispered. What do you mean, real? Do you think his skin color is his true self? The mother flinched slightly, but her face remained impassive. It's not the color of his skin, she said. It's that people can't change who they are. You thought love would change everything, but this world is tougher than you realize. He's not our type. That was always obvious, and you knew it, even if you didn't want to admit it. Elizabeth felt her mother's words overlap with her own doubts, which she had suppressed for years. Deep down, she knew that her parents, her friends, even her own beliefs created an insurmountable barrier between her and Jeffrey. She loved him, but that love always existed in a world full of unspoken rules and restrictions. It's not his fault, Elizabeth whispered, not noticing the tears starting to roll down her cheeks. It's society that doesn't give him a place. You all see him as just a black man, not a billionaire, not the man I love, just the color of his skin. The mother pressed her lips together but did not answer. Her silence spoke louder than any words. To her and many others here, Jeffrey would always be an outsider, someone who did not belong in their world. She would never accept him, because to her and to those around them, the boundaries between races were an immutable truth. Meanwhile, the tension in the room was growing. Some guests had already left, unwilling to remain in the middle of the scandal that had erupted. But the family's most loyal friends, those who had grown up in the same world as Elizabeth, remained. They stood in small groups, discussing what had happened, nodding to each other in agreement, as if to say that they had been right all along. He's gone too far, whispered one of the guests, an older man with graying hair known for his tough but not always open views on racial issues. I knew this marriage would fail. These people can't control their emotions. Yes, chimed in another guest, a powerful businessman with a thick gold watch on his wrist. It was a mistake from the start. They're just not like us. We try to give them a chance. And he didn't finish, but his interlocutors understood what he meant. In their world, people like Jeffrey were always other. In their view, the world was divided into us and them, and if they rose too high, it was always perceived as a threat. Elizabeth, standing at the altar, heard these conversations. Every whisper, every remark cut her heart like knives. She realized that her circle would never accept Jeffrey, no matter who he was. In their eyes, his success was temporary, and his place was always at the bottom. No matter how many billions he made, how many companies he built, they always saw him only for the color of his skin. Her love for him now seemed doomed. She realized that perhaps from the very beginning their relationship had been against all the unspoken rules that governed the world of her family and friends. She wanted to believe that love could overcome everything, but now she was faced with the bitter reality. At that moment, her father approached the altar, a tall, stately man with graying temples. He was the epitome of success and power, but his gaze, directed at his daughter, was stern and cold. Elizabeth, he began, without a trace of compassion, we told you, it was your own fault that this happened. This man was never part of our world, and you knew it. Now you see what happens when you try to mix things that shouldn't be mixed. Elizabeth looked at her father with disbelief and pain. You mean I shouldn't have loved him just because he's black? Her voice shook with anger. Is that all that matters to you? Her father looked at her with a stern smile. It wasn't me who decided this, Elizabeth. It's just the way the world works. You can never change what is the natural order of things. These words, spoken with such coldness, were the final blow to Elizabeth. She realized that her own family, her friends, this whole high world would never accept her love for Geoffrey. For them, his success was nothing more than an aberration, a temporary exception to the rules that they would always defend. She stood before her father, feeling her heart break with pain and despair, but in that moment, she understood one simple truth: it was not Geoffrey who was a stranger in this world, but she herself. Elizabeth stood still, as if the roots of her feet were rooted in the floor of this hall where all her dreams had just collapsed. Her heart was heavy, filled with the unbearable weight of knowing that her own family, those she loved and respected, had become a symbol of the deep, fundamental evil that had divided people by the color of their skin for centuries. Her father's gaze, cold and unyielding as stone, pressed down on her, as if it were depriving her of the ability to breathe. The guests continued to whisper, and her father's words echoed in her mind: "You can never change the natural order of things." That order was a prison for Geoffrey, for everyone like him. Elizabeth finally understood the depth of this racial prejudice. She could continue to love Geoffrey, but it became clear to her, he would always be an outsider. The stage slowly filled with people emerging from their corners to whisper and comment on what had happened. One of the women, a slender blonde with exquisite jewelry, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "I always said this marriage was a disaster. It's a disgrace to us. How could she get involved with someone like that?" Elizabeth heard the words without turning around, and the sounds were knives into her soul. Shame, is that what they called love? For her, this was deeper than racial hatred. It was an attack on her very freedom to choose who to love, who to accept into her life. She realized that her family and friends had always seen her love for Geoffrey as a threat to their privilege, to their ingrained notions of the world. Suddenly there was a noise from behind. It was Richard, one of her father's business partners, a large man with a loud voice and a brusque manner. He stepped forward, breaking the awkward silence, and said loudly, "It was inevitable, wasn't it?" His voice was thick with contempt. Everyone knew something like this would happen sooner or later. We all warned her. Elizabeth was blinded by money and power, but he's just a black guy who couldn't handle not fitting in with us. That's how it always is. Elizabeth felt a wave of indignation wash over her body. How could he, this man who had stood by her father's side at business meetings, who had seemed so polite and civilized to her, was now openly expressing his contempt for Geoffrey, all because he was black? "You don't know him," she said without turning around, but her voice was full of anger. "You don't know anything about him." Richard snorted, his thick fingers clenching around his glass of champagne. "What is there to know? People don't change, Elizabeth. We all saw it from the start. Your marriage to him would have been a disaster for your position. It's your own fault for not listening to us sooner." His words were like a sentence passed without a trial. Elizabeth suddenly felt completely alone in this room, among these people who called themselves her friends and family, but now openly showed their true colors. They would never accept Geoffrey. They would never accept her choice. And now, after all this humiliation, they would probably never forgive her for daring to go against their rules. She turned to her father, his face unreadable, but she could see a hint of satisfaction, as if he knew this was how it was supposed to end. "Are you proud of yourself, father?" Her voice was broken but firm. "Are you proud of the fact that you destroyed my life for the sake of your prejudices, for the sake of preserving the purity of our lineage?" He didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider her words, and then said slowly, "It's not prejudice, Elizabeth. It's reality. You can turn a blind eye to the truth all you want, but this world was built on divisions, on differences that can't be ignored. We can't live in a world where everything is mixed up. It would destroy us, and it would destroy you." The words struck her in the heart. She knew that her father's most important concern was maintaining power and control over his world, where whites remained at the top and people like Geoffrey were temporary disruptors. Elizabeth's love for Geoffrey was perceived as a betrayal because it threatened this fragile and outdated world. "You'll never accept him," she said, her voice full of bitterness, "because if you accept him, you'll have to admit that you've been wrong your whole life, that this whole system of yours, your values, is a lie. You're afraid of losing control, afraid to admit that we're all equal, and that's why you'll always despise people like Geoffrey." My father's lips tightened, his eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't answer. In his world, there were no such conversations, such things were not spoken out loud. He couldn't allow himself to admit that the world was changing, that his old beliefs, racism, privilege, classism, were becoming more and more fragile. For him, the only response to that truth was silence. At that moment, Jeffrey came back into the room. He stood in the doorway, his eyes hard and determined. Harvey and Trey followed him. The boy held his father's hand quietly, his eyes glistening with tears, but he stood up straight, like a little warrior. Jeffrey seemed to have already left behind the anger and pain he had been fighting all day. There was a steely determination in his eyes now. "I came back because I don't want to leave this like this," Jeffrey said, his voice confident. "I'm not going to let you just sweep this under the rug and carry on like nothing happened. You're all here. You've all seen how far your racism goes. And if you think this is the end, you're wrong. This is just the beginning." His words echoed like thunder throughout the room. No one dared interrupt him, not even the most influential and wealthy guests. They saw before them not just a black billionaire, but a man who had come to challenge the system in which they had lived their entire lives. "You won't destroy me. You won't make me feel worthless again," Jeffrey continued. "You may think you're above me. You may whisper behind my back, but the truth is, your world is falling apart. You're afraid that the world is changing, that people are starting to realize that we're all equal. You're afraid because you're losing control." He paused, his eyes turning to Elizabeth. "I came here to start a new life with the woman I love, but your world isn't ready for that, and I'm not going to stay in it if it means I have to prove my worth over and over again. I won't do that anymore." Elizabeth looked at Jeffrey, her heart breaking. She knew he was right. This world would never accept him, because he defied everything it was built on, and now she had to make a decision: stay in this world, maintaining the illusion of her privileged life, or leave with him, start over, but be truly free. She stepped forward and, without saying a word, took Jeffrey's hand. Elizabeth squeezed Jeffrey's hand tightly, and in that moment the world around them disappeared. She no longer heard the whispers of the guests, nor saw the disdainful glances that darted around the room. All that mattered was the deep look they shared, full of pain and hope. It was the moment she realized that she no longer wanted to live by the rules that were being imposed on her. "I'm leaving with you," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling inside. "I can't stay here any longer. Among these people who think love is something reprehensible, I want to be with you, and if that means starting over from scratch, so be it." Jeffrey looked at her with surprise, a spark of hope in his eyes, but also fear of losing her in this difficult world. He was ready for anything, but he did not know if he could withstand her decision. "Are you sure, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "It's going to be hard. We're going to face hatred, prejudice. You know how hard it's going to be." "I'm not afraid," she replied, her heart filling with determination. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of a life where my love is treated as a crime. I chose you, and I'm not going to back down." A real storm of emotions began to appear on the faces of those gathered. Some guests, not believing their ears, looked at them with horror and bewilderment. Others began to whisper among themselves. They could not believe that Elizabeth, their Elizabeth, would dare to challenge their norms. "This is madness," Richard's voice rang out, unable to remain silent. "You're betraying your family, your status, your life for him. He can't give you anything but trouble." "I'm not looking for wealth," Elizabeth replied, her voice growing louder. "I only want love and freedom, and it doesn't depend on status or skin color anymore." She turned to Jeffrey, their eyes met, and he finally saw the determination he was looking for in her eyes. He nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. Too, they were ready to fight. But at that moment Elizabeth's mother approached them. Her face was distorted with anger and grief. She could not understand how her daughter could choose such a path. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," she screamed. "You're playing with fire. This isn't just a decision. It's a betrayal. You can't go back. They won't accept you, and you'll lose everything." Losing it? Elizabeth looked at her mother, her heart trembling, but she was not going to back down. "I've already lost everything. If this is all I had, I can't live in a world that hates me anymore." The mother took a step back as if she had been struck. She couldn't believe that her daughter had chosen a path that she believed was doomed to failure. She tried again. "You will ruin your life, and him too. This is not love. This is rebellion. You do not understand what you will face." "I know what love is," Elizabeth interrupted. "I know what it is to be free, and if you can't understand that, I can't stay here." She turned back to Jeffrey, and there was determination in their eyes. In that moment, they both knew they were ready to face whatever life threw at them. They would no longer be victims of someone else's prejudices. The crowd slowly began to realize that this was not just a wedding scandal, but a real challenge. Jeffrey stepped forward, his voice loud and confident. "I am not afraid of your hatred. I am not afraid of your prejudices. I am here to declare that we all have the right to love, no matter what our skin looks like or how much money we have in our pockets. I believe that love wins, and I will fight for it." The silence in the room was deafening. Elizabeth felt her heart beat in unison with his words. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but now that they were together, it gave her strength. "If any of you think we're wrong," Jeffrey continued, "you're entitled to your opinion, but I'm not going to put up with anyone criticizing my love for Elizabeth. We both deserve to be happy." Gradually, some of the guests began to exchange glances, realizing that what was happening was not just a personal conflict. It became a symbol of the fight against outdated prejudices, against a system that left no room for true feelings. At that moment, Harvey, who was standing next to them, raised his hand. "I support you," he exclaimed, his voice sounding sincere. "We should all be able to love whoever we choose." This unexpected gesture caused shock among the guests, but then several people began to applaud, at first hesitantly, but soon louder and louder. Elizabeth felt hope filling her soul. The excitement in the room grew. People who had been silent before began to stand up, and with each passing moment, more and more of those who had supported them broke through the fear and prejudice. This was the beginning of something bigger. Elizabeth and Jeffrey stood together, embracing, and felt that they had finally found their way. Even if the whole world was against them, they knew that they had each other. They were ready to fight to prove that love can overcome any obstacle. As the applause began to die down and the tension in the room eased a little, Elizabeth felt time stand still around her again. Despite the support, there were still those who looked at them with disdain, with discontent, with disgust. They were the ones who did not want to see change, the ones who were afraid that their world might be destroyed. Jeffrey and Elizabeth realized that this was not just a wedding scandal, this was a real battle for their future. But suddenly the silence in the hall was broken by a sharp cry. "You're betraying your family, Elizabeth." Her mother screamed again, her voice shaking with rage and bitterness. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're losing everything we've built." Elizabeth felt her heart squeeze with pain. Every step she took towards freedom, towards love, was accompanied by the destruction of all her usual connections. She knew that she was choosing a difficult path, but still, it was her decision. "I can't live by someone else's rules anymore, Mom," she shouted back, her voice full of despair. "You never accepted me for who I am. You always wanted me to be your ideal, but I want to be myself." She turned to Jeffrey, and their eyes met again. She saw support in his eyes, but also fear of losing her because of the pressure that was being put on them. Meanwhile, a new wave of indignation began in the hall. One of the guests, red-cheeked and furious, stood up and shouted, "This is just absurd. You are ruining your life for some experiment. This guy is not for you." "I'm not an experiment," Jeffrey said, his voice low but determined. "I'm a human being, and I have a right to love." But amid the applause and support, there were also opponents. The cries of indignation began to mount, and the atmosphere became tense again. Jeffrey and Elizabeth felt the hatred fill the room, as if they were in the eye of a storm. "You don't understand what we're up against," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We're prepared to fight, but it's going to be a hard road." Suddenly one of the guests, a businessman known to many, stood up and, smiling, said, "I will never accept that someone like you would choose him. It's a disgrace. You will lose everything, your whole status, your whole life. It will all be destroyed, and you know it." Elizabeth felt her accusing gaze pierce her like a sharp blade at his words. She knew they were right. This would not be a simple choice. It would be a battle with themselves, with their past, with who they were. "You all talk about status," she said, her voice quiet but confident, "but at the end of the day, what's more important, money or love? I want to be with someone who makes me happy, not someone who lives up to your expectations." But the cries of hatred continued. She saw some guests clenching their fists, their faces contorted with rage and dislike. It was an unexpected reminder of how much society can sometimes judge those who choose to go against its rules. "You don't have to do this," Jeffrey interjected, his voice quieter but full of internal struggle. "We can leave. I don't want you to suffer because of me." Elizabeth stood for a moment, confused, torn between love and fear, but then, remembering how she felt when she was with him, how her heart filled with happiness, she felt that she could not leave him. "I won't leave," she said decisively. "I want to be with you, even if the whole world is against us." But at that moment, everything changed. From behind the guests, amidst the shouts and discontent, her father appeared, his face distorted with anger. He approached them, and his eyes sparkled with rage and disappointment. "You just don't know what you're doing," he said, clenching his fists. "This isn't just a wedding, Elizabeth. This is the end of your life. You're betraying us, betraying everything we've built. You think you can be happy with him? You'll lose everything." Elizabeth felt her heart break at her father's words. She knew he was right. There were many irreconcilable prejudices in this world, and if she chose Jeffrey, it would mean the complete destruction of everything she knew. But determination flared up in her soul again. "I'm ready for this," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I don't want to be a part of your world anymore if it means I have to give up my love." The silence in the room became deafening. Everyone felt that there was a spark in the air, a spark of struggle for the future, a spark of love ready to burn everything in its path. But then the unexpected happened. The doors to the hall swung open and several men in uniform walked in. Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. They hadn't come to celebrate. "We've received a call," one of the officers said, his voice stern. "There's a disturbance here, and we need to sort it out." Jeffrey and Elizabeth exchanged worried glances. This was what they had feared. The conflict that had erupted had now attracted the attention of the authorities. A few more steps and all this would turn into a nightmare. Jeffrey began, but the officer interrupted him. "Clear the scene. We are here to maintain order. If someone breaks the law, we are obliged to intervene." Elizabeth felt panic rise in her. Everything they had fought for could be destroyed in an instant. It wasn't just society that was against them now, but forces they couldn't ignore. "It's not a mess," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "We're just talking about love. We have a right to be together." The officers exchanged puzzled glances, and one of them stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We cannot allow violence to occur here. If you do not calm down, we will have to intervene." Jeffrey and Elizabeth knew that their words had no power in this context. In their eyes, this was not just a personal drama, but a public conflict, and now they were the center of attention that could turn against them. The door to the new life they had dreamed of now seemed closed. Elizabeth felt fear and anxiety grip her heart. She knew that this could end not just in humiliation, but in real tragedy. "Let's just leave," Jeffrey whispered, his eyes filling with bitterness. "I don't want you to suffer because of me." But Elizabeth, looking into his eyes, knew she couldn't leave him. They were bound by something deeper than just love. They were bound by a common struggle for their freedom and the right to be happy. And even if the world was against them, they had to stand together. "No," she said firmly, "I will stay with you, even if it means we have to fight to the end." Elizabeth and Jeffrey stood in the eye of a hurricane, feeling the tension build. The police looked at them, expecting the situation to be defused. But there was a threat in the air. Everyone around them was beginning to realize that their love had become a symbol of something larger, a conflict that could not be easily resolved. As the police began calling for backup, Elizabeth felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew their confrontation with society was just beginning, but she wasn't about to give up. Her heart filled with determination, and she turned to Jeffrey. "We have to be prepared for this," she said, her voice firm. "If they don't understand what's going on, we have to make sure they do." But how? Every moment the hatred grew around them, like clouds before a storm. The guests began to whisper, discussing their choice, and Elizabeth heard how some of them supported her, while others, on the contrary, spoke with contempt of Jeffrey. "He's not for you." Richard's voice came again. "You've ruined your life." Elizabeth looked at Jeffrey, and in his eyes she saw the same struggle she felt. Their love was being tested, and it was terrible. There was hatred all around them, and they were just two people who wanted to be happy. As help arrived, more officers entered the room. They began to surround Elizabeth and Jeffrey as if they were the cause of all the trouble. There was a noise all around, and people began to panic. Some even tried to leave the room. "Calm down," one of the officers said, his voice stern. "We just want to get to the bottom of the situation." But Elizabeth knew that sorted out meant only one thing: they were going to intervene and possibly arrest Jeffrey. And at that moment it became clear to her that they would have to fight not only society, but the system that supported that society. "We're not breaking the law," she said, her voice shaking but firm with determination. "We just love each other." The officers looked at each other, and one of them, a tall man with dark hair, stepped forward. "We are here to maintain order. If any of you feel that the situation is out of control, we can detain anyone who is aggressive." It sounded like a death sentence, and Elizabeth felt her heart tighten with fear again, but she couldn't afford to back down. She knew she had to speak up. "We don't want problems," she said, her voice growing a little louder. "We just want to live. We have the right to love, to happiness, regardless of the color of our skin." Some of the guests began to quietly applaud, but most were still against it. It was like fighting for their future, and Elizabeth realized that every word she said mattered. But then there was a scream. One of the guests, outraged by her words, rushed forward as if to stop her. Jeffrey stepped between him and Elizabeth, and at that moment everything turned into chaos. The officers tried to intervene, but the situation escalated to the breaking point. Elizabeth saw emotions reflected on people's faces: hatred, fear, anger. They did not understand that love could win. They did not want to see that there was a place in the world for everyone, regardless of race. "Get your hands off him," she screamed, trying to get to Jeffrey. She felt everything around her moving, as if they were both on the edge of a precipice, and every step they took could lead to a fall. The struggle was harder than they could have imagined. The officers tried to separate them, but Elizabeth and Jeffrey were determined. They knew that every moment, every second, mattered, and if they allowed themselves to give in, they would lose everything. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. One of the guests, who was at the edge of the room, grabbed a bottle and threw it on the floor, where it shattered into thousands of pieces. This was the signal for the beginning of real chaos. People started pushing each other, and the police tried to establish order, but it soon became clear that the situation was getting out of control. Elizabeth felt someone grab her shoulder. It was her mother, her eyes full of tears and fear. "Elizabeth, you don't understand what you're doing," she screamed. "You're going to lose everything. I can't watch you ruin your life." Elizabeth couldn't believe that her own mother was on the side of hatred. She reached out to Jeffrey, their hands clasped tightly. "I'm not destroying my life," she replied, her voice full of passion. "I'm building it. This is my life, and I want to live it the way I want to live it." But everything around them was swirling in a storm of emotions, and Elizabeth realized that this fight was only just beginning. They had to face not only the hatred of those around them, but also the prejudices that had been sitting in the consciousness of society for centuries, and this would be the hardest fight of their lives. The officers finally took action. They tried to separate Jeffrey from Elizabeth, and it was like tearing their souls apart. Elizabeth couldn't allow it. "No!" she screamed, her voice piercing the air like an arrow. "We will not be separated." She rushed towards him, and at that moment Elizabeth realized that this struggle was not only for their love, but also for the right to be heard, for the right to live in a world where they could be together without hiding from the gaze and condemnation. But no matter how hard they tried, the society they lived in was too strong. Every step they took, every word they said, was met with a powerful wall of hatred and prejudice, and at that moment, they realized that the only way forward was not only to fight, but also to accept that change takes time and sometimes sacrifice. Elizabeth squeezed Jeffrey's hand. Their feelings were full of pain, but also hope. They knew their journey would be long and difficult, but this was the only thing they had left: love that could overcome any obstacles, even if the world around them did not understand it. Elizabeth and Jeffrey stood on the edge of the abyss, aware that the struggle had only just begun. Though they were together, their hearts were weighed down by the weight of the prejudice they had to face. Jeffrey, in particular, felt the burden, and every new cry, every condemning word from the guests was like a blow to his dignity. After the police had separated the crowd and were starting to sort out the situation, they went out into the street, where everything was filled with many looks, full of hostility. Every time Jeffrey met someone's gaze, he felt his soul shrink. It was as if his skin color became a bright spot against the gray sky that did not give him peace. "This isn't just a wedding," he said as he and Elizabeth stepped away from the crowd to catch their breath. "This is a fight to not be judged for who we are." Elizabeth felt her heart fill with compassion. She knew how hard it was for him, In a world where prejudice and racism were everyday realities, his situation seemed especially vulnerable. Even among the people who supported them, there were still many who looked at them with judgment. "I always knew it would be hard," Jeffrey continued, looking away as if seeking solace in the world around him. "But sometimes I feel like fighting hate is like trying to fight a shadow. It always comes back." Elizabeth hugged him, feeling his body tremble with emotion. She understood that his struggle was not only personal, but also collective, connected to thousands of people who faced the same prejudices. These were years, centuries of suffering and struggle for equality. "You are not alone," she said quietly. "I am with you, and we will fight together. Don't let them break you." But Jeffrey knew that even her support couldn't change what they had already experienced. In that moment, he remembered how often he had encountered racism, from the small incidents of being turned away from a club to the more serious ones of being stopped by police officers for no apparent reason. Each time, it was like a knife in the heart that left scars. "I'm tired," he said, his voice thick with pain. "Tired of having my life always in the crosshairs. I just want to be seen as a person, not a stereotype." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that each of them had their own barriers to overcome. But in this society filled with prejudice, it was difficult to shake off the labels that were attached to them. Every step, every decision reflected not only their personal choices, but also public opinion, which sometimes seemed immovable and merciless. "Remember how we talked about our dreams?" Elizabeth said, trying to bring them back to that bright moment. "How you wanted to start your own business and change the world. We can still do that. It takes time, but every step forward is a step toward freedom." But Jeffrey knew that time was not something they could afford. Every day was a struggle against the prejudice that was dragging them into its net. And this wedding, this event, was supposed to be a symbol of hope, but it turned out to be a real test. "Sometimes it feels like every success I have is another battle," he said. "I can't just be happy. I always have to think about how my achievements are perceived. It's a constant struggle, and I don't know how much more strength I have left." Elizabeth hugged him tighter, knowing that this wasn't just his pain, it was the pain of everyone who suffered from racism. She knew that their love was meant to be a light in the darkness, but how could she free that light when there were so many shadows all around? "We can do this," she said confidently. "We can change the world, starting with ourselves. We must be the voice that speaks out in the silence, and even if it's hard, we must show that love can overcome hate." Jeffrey looked at her, his eyes filled with tears, but there was hope in them too. Elizabeth was right. Their love had to be the beginning of change, and they had to act. "Let's not be silent," he said, his voice full of determination. "Let's do this together. For us, for the future, for everyone who comes after us." They knew it would be a long journey, full of trials and tribulations, but they were ready. Their love, despite all the difficulties, would become the beacon that would lead to change. And in that moment, standing together, they decided that even if the world around them remained dark, they would be the light that illuminated the path to justice and equality. They were ready to fight not only for themselves, but for those who could not speak, for those who faced hatred every day. The wedding situation had a profound effect on Elizabeth and Jeffrey, filling their lives with new challenges and uncertainty. After being interrupted and having all this hatred thrown at them, they felt their bond had become stronger, but also much more fragile. Each new morning brought not only hope, but also the realization that they were now targets for judgment. When they returned home, the atmosphere was different. Elizabeth could feel her parents, though they didn't say it openly, becoming more wary. Every conversation became an interrogation, and every mention of Jeffrey a source of tension. She knew they disapproved of her choices, but now it was part of her life, part of her identity. "I can't hide it anymore," Elizabeth said, sitting alone with Jeffrey. "I can't live in this world where I'm judged by who I choose to be with. It's not right." Jeffrey nodded, understanding that their love had been tested, and they had to learn to cope with the aftermath. His eyes reflected emotion she knew well: anger, pain, but also hope. They both knew that their love was a symbol of something greater, and that gave them strength. "We can use this," Jeffrey said, his voice growing confident. "Let's make our struggle visible. Let people see that love is more important than prejudice. Let them know that we are not alone." Elizabeth agreed, and soon they began planning how exactly they could share their story with others. They decided to create social media, telling their story of love, sharing their experiences, and fighting against bias. Their goal was simple: to show that love knows no boundaries. With each new post and story, they felt the world around them change. People began to respond, share their stories, and support them. The community they created became a real support system, and Elizabeth realized that her parents were not the only ones who experienced bias. The messages were full of pain, but also hope, and that gave them strength. But not everything went smoothly. Sometimes, when they encountered disapproving glances, when they heard whispers behind their backs, Elizabeth felt old fears returning. Jeffrey, for his part, was struck by how deeply racism still permeated society. He encountered situations where he was simply not allowed into an establishment, when a police officer stopped him for no apparent reason. "I can't believe this is happening," he said one day as they discussed their experiences. "I thought we could move forward in the 21st century, but it seems like we're still in the same chains." Elizabeth understood his feelings, but she tried to remain optimistic. Every time they had a small success in their struggle, she felt their bond grow stronger. It wasn't just a fight for themselves, but for everyone else who faced similar challenges. Over time, they began organizing events to raise awareness of racism and bias. They held meetings where they shared their stories, inviting others to open up about their experiences. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. They began to be joined by people from all over the country who also wanted to change the world. However, they faced challenges at every step of the way. One such evening, after a successful event, they encountered a group of people who did not share their views. These people began shouting and insulting them, claiming that their love was a disgrace and a destruction of tradition. Elizabeth felt her breathing getting harder. She remembered how she had felt at the wedding, when the hatred had rained down on them, but now she knew she had support. Jeffrey was standing next to her, and their love was stronger than their hate. "We won't give up," she said with confidence, and at that moment there was a strength in her voice that she herself hadn't expected. "We're here to be together, and nothing can change that." That night was a turning point in their lives. They realized that their fight would not end overnight, and even if they faced rejection, their love could be the light that would illuminate the path for others. With each new step, with each new story, they not only fought for themselves, but also inspired others. Elizabeth and Jeffrey understood that each of their steps was a step towards freedom, a step towards equality, and even if the world around them was full of hatred, they knew that together they could overcome any obstacles. Despite Elizabeth and Jeffrey's best efforts, dark clouds of hatred and prejudice loomed over their lives. Every step they took not only brought them closer together, but also exacerbated the contradictions in society. And although they felt supported by friends and associates, threatening signs appeared on the horizon more and more often. One day, after another event where they shared their story, they noticed that someone was following them. Jeffrey, sensitive to any signs of threat, felt that an atmosphere of hatred was gathering around them. When they went outside, they were surrounded by a group of people insulting and threatening them. Elizabeth tried to remain calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She remembered what it had been like on their wedding day, when hatred had pierced them. Now they were facing rage, and fear was taking hold of her. "Get out of our way!" one of the aggressors shouted, and the crowd took up his words. Hatred and anger poured down on them like a raging ocean, sweeping away everything in its path. Jeffrey, feeling the tension rising, stepped in front of Elizabeth. He didn't want her to become a victim, but suddenly, one of the men in the crowd pushed him, and everything became chaos. Jeffrey tried to push the aggressor away, but at that moment another one jumped on him, and soon they found themselves in the middle of a violent confrontation. Elizabeth screamed, but her cries were drowned out by the sounds of struggle. She tried to get to Jeffrey, but she was stopped by someone holding her shoulders. Fear and helplessness overwhelmed her as she watched the man she loved try to defend himself, but his resistance was becoming increasingly hopeless. Despite the police's best efforts to intervene, the timing of their arrival was critical. Jeffrey was already on the ground when the crowd began to disperse. Elizabeth rushed to his side, her heart breaking with fear and pain, but she realized that their entire struggle had been in vain. Instead of uniting the people, the hatred had only increased. When all was quiet and Jeffrey was taken away in an ambulance, Elizabeth was left alone, surrounded by whispers and condemnation. She knew that this day had changed everything. She was left with nothing but emptiness, fear, and the bitterness of seeing their dreams of freedom and equality turn into a sad reality. At that moment, when she looked at the world that could not accept them, She realized that sometimes, despite all the courage and desire to change the situation, hatred can be stronger. This fight turned out to be not only personal, but also a cruel game, where love, unfortunately, does not always win. Elizabeth sat in the hospital, waiting for news about Jeffrey. Her heart was breaking with pain and fear. Every honk of the car, every step of the nurse made her flinch. There was a growing feeling inside that their dreams of a bright future were simply dissolving into thin air. When the doctors finally emerged, their faces were serious. Elizabeth felt the world around her stop. She couldn't believe what they were telling her. Jeffrey had not survived. All their efforts, all their fight for love and justice, had been in vain. She felt the life drain from her heart, leaving only emptiness and despair. At that moment, Elizabeth realized that the hatred they had faced was not just a word, it was a reality that was not easy to cope with. She was left alone, burdened not only with loss, but also with the bitter realization of how cruel the world was. Her life would never be the same after that night. She lost not only her lover, but also her belief that love could change everything. The days became endless waiting, filled with silence and bitterness, and although she continued to speak of her love and shared Jeffrey's story, only a shadow remained in her soul, reflecting the tragedy of their struggle. Thus, Elizabeth and Jeffrey's story ended on a sad note, reminding us that sometimes even the brightest dreams can be overshadowed by the dark realities of the world we live in. If you enjoyed this story, please let us know in the comments what you think. Have you ever experienced racism or bias in your life? We really value your opinion and want to hear your stories. Each of you is very important to us, and we are truly grateful for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it if you want to see more stories like this. Have a wonderful day.